Okay, it is time. This is Matthew Morookian. I'm a senior manager of product marketing. Thanks for joining our webinar today, Fraud Detect and Supplier Risk. We're going to walk through the Apex Portal dashboard. Well, not we. Akhilesh Agarwal is here. He's the Senior Vice President, Global Business Partner Technology Solutions, which basically means he leads everything related to Apex Portal, software, and IT at Apex. So he's the guy to tell you about Apex Portal and what we're doing to protect everyone against fraud. There's something in this webinar that we haven't talked about anywhere before, and it's the Apex Network Fraud Alert Score. And it's going to be pretty interesting. I think it's pretty disruptive in the fraud prevention market. And one thing I just want to tell everyone, please ask questions. There's a chat on the side that you can just insert a question. And also, if you want to ask a question, I can unmute you. So just type in, I have a question, and so you can ask it to us, and maybe you'll have a follow-up question. I just want to make it as interactive as possible. And so I'm going to hand it over to Akhilesh. Akhilesh, you ready to show them the portal?
I'm ready, Matthew.
Good.
And thank you for the introductions, and really glad to be here presenting with all of you today. As Matthew mentioned, we are going to be talking about a 360-degree view and a dashboard around risk and compliance and how it all fits in together. In some of the previous demos and webinars that we did last week and earlier, we talked about registration, we talked about several controls, we talked about risk management, and today we are going to see a few dashboards where everything plugs into a single place and how effective it becomes once you have all of that data together. So today's session, I'm going to begin by logging in as an internal controls person, right, from a risk management perspective. And I'm going to start the session by opening one of the risk dashboards. So what all of you are seeing on the screen right now is a 360-degree view of everything related to risk and controls in our system. This is a personalized dashboard based on the user who has logged in. So you can see my name on the top left corner, which is Akhilesh Agarwal's risk dashboard. I'll kind of, there's a lot going on the screen, so I'll kind of step you through each section and talk about what it means from a risk mitigation perspective. On the top left corner, you're seeing seeing a world map, which is right now focused on United States. There are different filters for various countries, which we can select from here. So right now, US is selected, so you see the US world map. On the map, you're seeing some tags, which are red or yellow. And what that indicates is the high risk or a medium risk, right? So we have kind of filtered out any suppliers who are not at risk based on the overall risk score. So attention can be given to highest risk suppliers. The size of the indicators also measures the spend of those vendors. So if I hover the mouse on one of the pointers, you will see US Foods as one of the suppliers having a spend amount, in this case of $247 million, and so on and so forth. Any of these filter criteria can be saved. So if I hit the save button, next time I open the dashboard, I don't have to start from scratch. On the top right corner, you're seeing some additional filters like segmentation, company codes, or operating units. You're seeing spend information and categories and the type of risk you want to filter upon. So these are some examples. Obviously, in an actual implementation, the pick list or the values will be based on how your ERP is configured. On the bottom left corner of the screen, you're seeing the overall composite risk, which is 90 out of 100, based on the top 10 vendors having a risk score. And you see a list of top 10 vendors at the bottom of the overall risk score, right? So US Foods being on the top. This is all made up data, by the way. So this is just to demonstrate some of the capabilities. Then we see a trend line, right? So the system is also tracking risk over a period of time. So in this case, the trend line indicates the risk of last 6 months. So it has overall grown plus 18 points. And you're also noticing which vendors have increased risk score and other vendors where the risk score actually decreased, right? So we are tracking both and indicating the trend on this dashboard. There are two other types of risk indicators. There are many other risk indicators that you don't see on this dashboard, but when we drill down, you'll see examples of those. So you can, based on your focus area, you can drag and drop some of these widgets on the risk dashboard. So for this session, I've used the fraud risk indicator and the financial risk indicator as additional data points, right? So overall fraud risk score of 64, overall financial risk of 80. So that's how the dashboard is presented with some of the details, which is comprising of the overall risk score. So it gives you a preview of everything happening in the system at one glance. And we have alerts built into the system. So if the trend increases based on certain type of suppliers, you get alerts and notifications, which encourages you to come into this dashboard, drill down on the details, and take some actions on it. We also have some recommended actions that we are going to talk about. So now to get down to a detailed view, I'm going to hover the mouse on one of the vendors here called US Foods, and we'll click on it to drill down to the next view. So the previous dashboard was overall risk score across the board, every single vendor loaded into our system. This view is representing risk at a vendor level. So you can see an example here, US Foods Inc. Total risk score, the trend line for this vendor over the last 6 months, which is specific to this vendor, not an overall trend line. Now, on the top right corner, you're seeing what type of vendor it is. It's good for resale, goods for not resale, and so on and so forth. What type of products and services the vendor is providing, for example, food services, total spend, and who the buyer is in the system. So we are able to capture that as well. We show a map where the vendor's physical address is located, and the address of the vendor and where they are located is also comprising of the risk score, and we'll talk about it, how that matters shortly. At the bottom of the screen, you're seeing a variety of risk scores related to the supply US food. So we have a category called identity risk score. We have a category called fraud risk score, financial risk score, and the list goes on. All of these categories are configurable. So these are some of the standard out-of-box configured categories that you can take advantage of. But because it's configurable during any implementation, if there's a specific focus area, then we can add those categories and configure the system differently. So what comprises of the identity risk score? We have a lot of attributes in each of these sections. Why identity risk score is important is it indicates, are you doing business with the right vendor, right? So you think you're doing business with US Foods, but are they really the US Foods that you know of, right? Or is it some fictitious company who's impersonating US Foods? So that is one of the examples of identity risk score. So let's take a look at some of the attributes which creates the identity risk score. So duplicate vendor, that's the very first check we do to make sure you don't have the same vendor repeated multiple times in the system. Duplicate vendors causes other indirect issues like overpayments, duplicate payments, and so on and so forth. We also check an important attribute which is proprietary to Apex called the Apex known supplier. The Apex known supplier helps identify is the vendor doing business with other Fortune 500 or other Fortune 1000 clients of Apex, or you're the only company doing business with this vendor, right? This can happen if you're dealing with a lot of mom and pop vendors, which have their entire business dedicated to you as a client. But it also helps mitigate a lot of fraud instances. So we have this check in both the identity score as well as the fraud risk score, which you'll see later on. So Apex known vendor helps mitigate issues related to identity of the vendor, but also any collusion that may be happening within your company. So if your internal employees are actually owning the LLC and they create a fictitious company and are colluding, it helps mitigate some of the risk associated with collusion, right? So we have this as part of the identity check. We also do several other checks on identity, like a legal name match based on tax ID. So this is important because if you're paying a supplier and let's say you have a W-9, you want to make sure the name of the supplier is correct, it matches the tax ID, and you have the right W-9 on file. If you don't, not only it creates risk related to fraud, but it also creates risk related to compliance, meaning you may get a B notice from IRS. So we have that as part of identity risk score. The list goes on, like Secretary of State match. So is the vendor not only matching with the tax ID, are they really registered with the Secretary of State? And are they active as a business? And if they are not active, we'll fail the check like you are seeing on the screen. All of these attributes have a risk score. So in case of a failure, the risk score will significantly increase, like 100 here. But if the validations pass, you have significantly less risk, so the score is 0. In certain cases, it may vary between a value of 0 to 100. We are doing legal name match against the bank record. So not only is the vendor's tax ID matching the name of the vendor, but is the name matching their bank records. Name matching with DNB. So external sources are factored in. You can see on the additional risk elements on the bottom right corner, there's a DNB report that we pulled on this vendor. So using attributes coming from the DNB report, we are also contributing to the identity risk score, right? Then we are taking the address of the vendor, matching it with postal services, making sure the address is good and is an active address. It's not a vacant address or a prison address, for example. We are making sure the business entity type matches the tax record. That's another validation. Where if you have a vendor who's claiming to be a nonprofit, but IRS has a database where they have a list of all nonprofits. If the vendor is not found on that list, then it's really not a nonprofit, right? So that may affect how you withhold taxes on this given vendor. So we are doing that identity check. Entity type check on the bank records. So you think you're paying an LLC, but the bank record indicates it's an individual, right? So there may be an issue in the bank account ownership type, and we are validating that as well. So I won't go through every single attribute, but those were some of the very important attributes to highlight in this session. Very quickly, other attributes like, is the URL for the business existing? Are they able to accept emails? We are able to do, in a lot of cases, board of directors check or the name of the CEO. Company still exists in Secretary of State using external data points. So using a variety of these attributes that you're seeing on the screen, we are able to capture all of these data points and create an overall identity risk score, right? So those are structured data elements that we capture on any given vendor. On the right side, as I
Akhilesh,
go ahead,
I just want to jump in for 1 second because you talked about the Apex known vendor, and I think the last count I heard was 4.7 million vendors that are using Apex Portal. Do you have any other, like, if I was watching this webinar, I kind of wonder, are my suppliers using Apex Portal? Do you have any other data points around what types of suppliers and anyone on the demo? We can discuss this afterwards, because many times, is one of your competitors, using Apex Portal that could help align with the suppliers that you currently have?
Yes, so that's a great question, Matthew. And a way to look at it is uh, not only the known vendor check works against all other clients who are using Apex Portal directly, but we also do the known vendor check against our Smart VM database. What that means is we are really checking against a database of 40 million supplier records. Why we are checking against 40 million is Apex not only offers the Apex portal as a SaaS platform, but we also, for the last 30 years, have been doing audit for accounts payable against many other Fortune 1000 clients. So we also know how many non-Apex portal clients are also doing business with a variety of vendors, right? We are in contact with those 40 million suppliers for multiple reasons, whether it's portal or we are doing a statement audit or any type of other recovery services. So based on our database of 40 million suppliers and the validations we have run against more than 700 data sources external, we are able to validate, scorecard the suppliers, and ultimately create the known vendor check, right? So the known vendor check, think about a database of 40 million global suppliers, and that's what we are validating against, right? Now, other data points to your question is, as we are working with vendors, right? The known vendor is just one of the checks, but we are validating against so many other attributes that you see on the screen, some of which are proprietary to Apex, like the entity type check or the name of the bank account score. I'll kind of talk more about it, how it's proprietary. But we do that on a global basis now, and we have a scorecard for the bank ownership name score, and that can be leveraged as well.
Thanks. Any questions, just throw them in the chat. Back to you, Akhilesh.
Thank you. So what I was talking about on the bottom right corner is additional risk elements. So you saw a lot of attributes that Apex is in the background validating, scoring, and it helps create the identity score. But we also pull data from external sources. So if you have a subscription with DNB, or we can bundle it in this risk dashboard, we can pull data elements from DNB, LexisNexis, Experience, or even your homegrown system or any other third-party tool that you use, right? So all of those additional risk elements can be fetched from external data sources. We have additional features of questionnaires that I demonstrated earlier in one of the webinars. So using questionnaires, we can add to the overall risk score. And we also have a global insight feature, and questionnaires and global insight I'll talk about in some of the subsequent risk scores like fraud and financial and so on. So think about this risk dashboard as a very comprehensive 360-degree view on every single supplier and all your suppliers, right? So you can see a lot of elements are contributing to the risk score of US Foods as a vendor, the overall composite risk score. Identity is just one of them, and then identity has so many other contributing factors. I'll walk all of you through a couple more examples. Fraud is one of the most pressing concerns out there in the industry, and how do we mitigate it? How do we get alerted about it? And so on and so forth. So apexanalytix has a fraud detect module, which kind of fits right into this 360-degree risk dashboard. And how it works is, on a fraud detection level, we have a lot of attributes and validations built in. Some of these, you saw it in the identity. So we are reusing some of those attributes here for the purposes of fraud detection. But there are also many unique identifiers here. So known vendor gets reused. But let's now talk about the Apex network fraud alert score. Because we have so many clients using our system, and millions of suppliers who are logging into the Apex portal and doing transactions on a daily basis, including updating their bank accounts. So ultimately, a change in bank account is a net result of an alleged or a attempted fraud, right? Unless there's an issue with the bank account, the chances of an actual fraud happening is very little, right? Because if you're paying the right vendor, an identity validation is good, and you're paying the right bank account, the money is going to the right person or the right business. But most of the frauds which happen on a day-to-day basis is money going into a wrong bank account for various reasons. So what Apex has done is we have created a proprietary score called the Apex Network Fraud Alert Score. We track the activity of millions of suppliers on our Apex portal on a day-to-day basis. And as they transact and as they make bank account changes and we validate it, we score it, it goes through approval queues and different clients are approving or rejecting it. So we are able to detect an attempted fraud. So in some cases, let's say the supplier's email address got compromised and a fraudster impersonated the supplier and logged into the system. Because of various additional controls which are built into the system, we are still able to prevent that change from happening, right? But even though we prevented it, we still learned about that attempted change and it raised the fraud alert score in our system. So what we now are able to do is take that attempted fraud scenario and based on the scorecard, alert any other clients who are using the risk dashboard of that attempted fraud. And this way, if you happen to have the same vendor that other clients are using, and in one of the other instances, there was an attempted fraud on a given vendor, you also get alerted about it so that you can take some precaution if there is a bank account change in your system as well for the same vendor, right? So this is a very important fraud alert score, and it helps the entire network and all of our clients using the system.
Akhilesh, we have a question. So the risk dashboard flags some US specific indicators, for example, referencing IRS lists and databases. You mentioned the risk analysis considers global suppliers. Can it be adapted to consider other flags for other global regions like the UK, Europe, or Asia?
Excellent question. So the vendor I picked for today's session happens to be a US based vendor. Therefore, you're seeing some US specific examples in the identity tab or fraud tab, right? But if I open a risk dashboard for a non-US vendor, let's say a UK vendor or a French vendor or a Asia Pac specific vendor like India, China, etc., then any and all risk indicators or scores or validations that we do for those specific countries will show up and the US specific attributes will go away, right? So the system adapts automatically based on where the vendor is located and what all attributes are applicable. To further illustrate on that, let's say you have a UK vendor, we are able to validate the VAT number and other company house information from the UK authorities and make sure the UK vendor has that valid identity, right? So IRS issues EIN numbers in the US or the Social Security issues SSN. But in UK, it's the VAT number that we are validating or the company, the customs house company registration number, right? Which is the CRN number. Similarly, for India, we'll validate the PAN number. For South Africa, we'll validate the VAT number in that country. For Malaysia, we'll validate the GST number and so on and so forth. So we have a lot of country-specific attributes which automatically get displayed based on the country of the vendor.
Thank you, Akhilesh.
All right. So coming back on the fraud, I talked briefly about the fraud alert score, right? If you know of an attempted fraud, we'll alert you. There's another similar score on fraud. Now this is a confirmed fraud, right? So over here, it's a green check, which means we are not aware of any payment frauds on this vendor. But let's say for whatever reason, there was an actual fraud which happened and money did go out to incorrect hands, and we learn about that fraud flag, then we'll alert clients, right? Meaning it's an alleged fraud where the money is confirmed to go out to potentially wrong hands, right? So the first score was attempted fraud. The second score is alleged fraud. So it's very useful for different clients on making sure the risk scores are computed dynamically on the fly and in real time. There are many other risk attributes. For example, we match your employee database with the supplier's information. So if your internal employee has a bank account number which is matching with your supplier's bank account number, that's a potential issue. Employee name with a vendor name match, right? Tax ID match, employee's SSN matching a vendor's SSN, right? Or their address is matching or phone number is matching. So we have a laundry list of employee to vendor matches that contribute to the fraud indicators or potential fraud indicators. Then we have another flag here saying employee is also the buyer for this vendor, right? So not only you got employee to vendor matches, but the employee is also transacting with this vendor as a buyer, right? Which also significantly increases the fraud flag. Matched employee is a senior management person, which is another cause for concern, right? So we have a lot of employee to vendor match attributes. Then we in fraud we have proprietary bank pro scores, which is we are calling Smart VM Bank Pro scores. How this works is for a list of countries, we are validating the bank account ownership. So for US, for Sweden, for India, we are able to go to the actual external sources, the banking networks, validate the name on the account with the name of the vendor. But then on top of that, we are creating a Apex proprietary score for every single country in the world, every single bank country in the world, and indicating how likely the bank account belongs to the given supplier. We know that, and we can compute the score because we have 40 million plus suppliers in our SmartVM database. We also have history of transactions with the supplier, saying how many payments are going to the supplier for that specific bank account, how many other clients are using the same account to pay the given vendor, what is the age of the account, and so on and so forth. So those are some examples. So using a variety of these information that Apex has access to in our SmartVM database, because we are validating, scoring it, we are creating this global bank account ownership or confidence score, and you are able to leverage it in fraud mitigation, right? So this is available on a global basis.
So Akhilesh, I have a couple questions. One, you're talking about employee vendor matches. Now, I was just talking to a prospect, and they had a fraud recently because of an employee. Can you tell me a little bit of how are you identifying that, or what are the data points being captured? And then speak to, I know some companies are going to have privacy concerns. What are some processes that need to be instituted?
Sure. So on the matching process, there are several examples on my screen, right? I'll name a few. So one of the most important matches is the tax ID match, right? Because if an employee social security number is matching the tax ID of an LLC, for example, that's a typical match scenario. That's a potential fraud indicator. Why would your employee have the same tax ID as one of your suppliers getting millions of dollars of payments, right? So that's one of the matches, but you can see a series of other matches like phone number match, address match, potential name match, and so on and so forth, right? So we are using a combination of all these criteria to match your internal employees with external suppliers, right? Now, on the list of privacy concerns and what features we have built in is we work with your employee database and we take an extract of it and load it into the Apex portal for the purposes of this matching, right? All of this data is encrypted either during transmission or while we are storing it, right? So it's all encrypted, it's safeguarded based on roles-based security, and only used for the purposes of matching with any one of these fraud attributes, right? So the access to this data is highly restrictive, it's encrypted, and only used in the matching purposes. We also are very careful on only fetching the data required for the purposes of this match. So for example, we are not going into your employee database or even pulling attributes like compensation and other attributes that are not needed, right? We are only focusing on what is the title of the employee, tax IDs, address, phone number, so that we are able to use those indicators or data points and match it with your vendor records, right? So it's highly secure, just like your vendor's data. We also treat employee data the same way with maximum security.
Thanks. Let's continue, and then I have some other questions written down.
All right, perfect. So these are some of the examples. I talked about banking, but the list goes on, right? The fraud detect feature that we have on this risk dashboard is so comprehensive and with hundreds of attributes, right? So the list goes on the bank account change, right? Is the bank country mismatching? Name of the supplier doesn't match the name of the bank country. That's a potential fraud scenario because a lot of fraudsters get payments in foreign countries. Then we have sanctioned banks. So think about sanctioned vendors on our OFAC list, but are you making payments to sanctioned banks? So that's another check that we do. Is it a bank account change with corresponding new contact details, right? That's always related to a potential fraud. So we are doing that check here. How many times the bank account was changed in a given week? Was a password reset just before making a bank account change, and so on and so forth, right? On the address, we are doing high risk locations, residential addresses, prison address matches, PO box addresses, and so on, right? On the contact level, we are checking against cell phones being used for large corporations, or maybe it's high risk industry. Then we have a very comprehensive list of invoice criterias which are contributing to potential fraud. So if you look at this list on invoicing, we are checking for out of sequence invoice numbers. We are looking at Benford's law, which kind of indicates the generation of potential fraudulent invoices based on invoice amounts, invoice numbers, or the dates of the invoices, and so on and so forth, right? So there are various invoice level attributes that we are using to detect potential fraud, whether it's on the gross invoice amounts, escalating invoice amounts, which means the trend is it's constantly increasing without a valid reason. And then one of the most important checks we do is business email compromise questionnaire. Typically, a lot of fraud originates because the supplier's email address is itself compromised and the fraudsters are impersonating the supplier. So we actually have a business email compromise assessment questionnaire that the suppliers have to fill out in addition to all these background checks that we are doing. And using a combination of those, we are verifying the suppliers are also in a position with policies and procedures in place to mitigate fraud itself, right? So we are creating a combination of or using a combination of all internal attributes, external data sources, news sources. We are creating the fraud detect score, right? So there's a lot of information here. I'll be happy to answer any questions that come up in your mind. One last example I want to talk about is financial. So we talked about identity fraud, and now how does financial risk score work? So using external data sets like DNB, using some of the other attributes like status of the business, is the vendor still active and doing business or not? We have a questionnaire, which is a financial questionnaire, and then also news sources, right? So again, using a combination of internal, external attributes, we create an overall financial risk score, right? And then this list goes on: data security, ethics, you have reputational, regulatory, and so on and so forth, right? Now, we saw the list of attributes, we saw some of the external sources. I do want to take a moment and drill down on some of these external elements and show you how that works.
Akhilesh, before you drill down into this, we just have a question I wanted to have you answer. So often a person who does not have a tax ID number uses their social security number, and this number would be used to match to vendors. Is this information viewable by Apex or the company doing the comparison?
Yeah, so think about it as an automated step. So once the social security number is sent to Apex, we encrypt it and store it. And now the system, which is automated, is using that encrypted number to match against your vendor's tax IDs, right? So the system is doing an automated comparison. From Apex perspective, we are not opening that data and manually taking a look at it or matching it, right? So it's an automated system using encrypted values to match against your supplier's data. Now, in terms of who can view it if needed, the controls are based on roles. So as a client, if you designate certain roles to your internal users, let's say from an HR department or other elevated access roles, then they can potentially view it, but it's based on how you allow it as a client, right? So if you don't want anyone to view any of these tax IDs, you have full control over it, and you just don't assign those roles, and it will never be viewable to any internal or external person.
Thank you.
All right. So coming back on the drill down, I'm going to click on this DNB report, and let's see how that works, right? So once I click on it, here's a screen which is showing the DNB report of US Foods as a supplier. So this report is basically a snapshot or a PDF version of a point in time how that DNB report looked like when we pulled it, and we store a copy of it, right? On a frequent basis, we can pull new DNB reports and keep the risk scores updated, right? So this is based on the DNB subscription. You can see DNB provided us with all of these attributes that are mentioned on the screen, like year of formation, what's their working capital, most importantly, what's their financial strength in terms of DNB rating. So using this information, we are able to calculate the overall risk score of the vendor, right? So we store a copy of the report, but we extract data from this external report, pull it here, and create a risk score. The same way I talked about financial questionnaires. I did demo this in a previous webinar. So it provided the supplier logged into the system and answered some of the risk questionnaires. Financial questionnaire is just happens to be one of those. We have other questionnaires like IT questionnaire, BCP questionnaire, and so on and so forth. So the supplier is able to go in, answer one or more of these questionnaires, and then once they answer it, we create a overall risk score based on questions, right? And then I'll also click on this financial risk score based on new scorecard, and we'll be able to take a look at it shortly. So just give it a moment while the system is loading the data. So based on whether it's an internally captured data attribute and whether we have validated or not, whether we have fresh data from external sources like DNB or the questions the supplier answered, or based on the new scorecard, we are able to compute a comprehensive risk score based on this category, and then use all the category risk scores to present the overall risk score, and we capture that trend as well. Any questions so far?
No more questions from the audience, but please chime in if you have one. And if you want to ask it live, just send a note, say I have a question, and I will unmute you.
Okay, so I was able to get to the drill down here. So you can see here's an example of news-based scorecard, which are drilled down on the previous dashboard. So we are pulling news from 300 plus external sources, 300,000 plus external sources, and we are monitoring for negative news, positive news, etc. Just on financials, the vendor had some negative news. So we were able to take this financial news scorecard and kind of retrofit it here in the Apex Global Insight, right? The same way, I clicked on the financial questionnaire, so all of that data is now loaded. And one of the list of questions here is the financial questionnaire. You're seeing, a high risk on financial questions. And once I click on it, any of these tabs, it will load the questions answered by the supplier for that particular category. And then we can drill down on the details provided by the supplier. So basically, the system allows us to drill down on any of these categories, capture the data elements, whether it's answered by the supplier or automatic validation or scorecarding by the system. And then we have alerting built into place so that you can focus your time and energy where the highest risk is and take preemptive actions before it starts impacting your organization, right? So I clicked on the financial questionnaire. You can see a list of questions we asked the supplier about their finances, like are they owned or governed by a government organization, or are they a public official, right? If they answer yes or no, depending on the context of the question, the ratings can be either below your expectations or above expectations. And then based on that, if it is below expectation, we create a risk score and tie it up. All of these points are configurable. So what that means is if one of these questions is of significant importance to your company, we can actually create a higher risk score points, and the actual score can be different than just 1 point each, right? So you have full flexibility on configuring the weightage as well. So that's all I wanted to cover in today's walkthrough. Just to summarize, we saw the overall risk dashboard, which was the starting point here, right? Which lists every single vendor in your system, the trend of the risk scores going up and down, different type of categories. Then we clicked on the drill down and we saw some of the different risk categories and how each risk score is generated. And then we finally drill down on the external DNB report, the questionnaires, and the global insight.
So Akhilesh, we have a question from a friend of ours, and this is, so does fraud detect in First Strike interchange with the portal? Is it wise to use just the portal to score vendors or use both?
A great question. So what you just saw on the screen is a newer version of fraud detect, right? So the traditional fraud detect, some of our clients from many years ago who have been subscribing to First Strike fraud detect. So yes, First Strike fraud detect has a lot of features or attributes that you're seeing on the screen built into it, like the employee vendor match, the invoice attributes, vendor attributes, and so on. But what you're seeing on the Apex portal, and especially this risk dashboard, is an enhanced version of that same toolkit, which now retrofits additional layers of scoring, like Apex known vendor, the Bank Pro scoring, the Apex network fraud alert score, and so on and so forth. So consider this as a newer version of it, which you can upgrade to in Apex portal.
So we just posted a poll. If you would like us to follow up with any of the information listed in the poll, please check one of the boxes. I want to go back to one thing, and it's about kind of the confidence score, the bank account confidence score, and the value of it, because we are unable to validate the ownership outside of like in most countries. In the US we can, and some other countries we can, but the confidence score really allows us to ensure that either it's valid bank account, or people need to review it and talk to the supplier or talk to an internal person or whatever the recommendations are. Now, Akhilesh, you know this case a little bit more than I, and that one thing that suppliers do is they'll have an email where multiple people are using the email. And can you just hit on how problematic that is? Because when we talk about these controls, they're more protecting the suppliers, because the suppliers' controls are going to fail. and most likely yours are more going to stay in place.
That's right, Matthew. And basically, the scenario is because either of shared email accounts, which is a big no from a security standpoint, but from time to time, you'll encounter suppliers who have a shared mailbox, right? What that means is any user credentials for logging into the system that we have in place is now compromised because of the shared mailbox from in the supplier's network, right? So if we send usernames or passwords or someone creates a new password, it is very easy for other people sharing the same email account to request a new password or get access to the system because the email account itself is compromised from a supplier's network, right? What that also leads to is you have no accountability on who's actually using that email account or who's the real owner, right? Because the moment the email account can be accessed by multiple people, there's lack of ownership, lack of transparency, lack of traceability on who's really making changes because it could be any one of those shared or people sharing the mailbox. So that's the fundamental problem associated with it. To mitigate it, we have additional controls like multi-factor authentication, but that also can be easily compromised because even the multi-factor authentication code is typically sent to the business email, because if we send it to the personal email account, an ex-employee who's no longer employed with the supplier can just walk away and still have access to the system. So we made a business decision to make sure authentication codes are also sent to supplier's mailbox. Now, if it is shared, it that control also loses its weight. The next step is security questions and answers, where only the individual from the suppliers org, they're picking a security question for which they only know the answer to. But in a shared mailbox scenario, the suppliers will typically put answers that are again common knowledge, which again, destroys the purpose of having security questions and answers, right? So lastly, we created another set of controls on the actual bank account change, which is, the supplier has to enter the previous account number before they can change to the new account number. So an imposter may not know the existing account number. We validate the likelihood of the bank account belonging to the supplier using our scoring or external validations. And then we also have additional login pattern detection, whether the supplier is logging in at 2 a.m. versus business hours, or they're logging in from a country which the supplier doesn't operate in, or impossible travel, and so on and so forth. So there's multiple layers of security built in. I won't go through every one of it, but there are more than 20 to 30 controls just on security itself to mitigate a lot of these risks. But in the end, the supplier also has to take some ownership on protecting their own data by making sure at least their business email is not compromised.
So Akhilesh, this is, I think, the fourth demo we've done. I think this is the most amount of information. This is very dense. This video is on demand, it'll be on demand tomorrow. So if anyone wants to watch it or share it with a friend, they don't have to register. You can just send the link. But next week, we're going to dive into diversity. So we've been talking about risk and fraud for the past 4 weeks. Next week at the same time, it's going to be how to use apexportal to increase supplier diversity spend. We've been adding a lot. The portal has always been able to validate diversity status with the SBA, but we've been adding a lot more local and regional organizations, either governmental or NGOs, that have a database of diverse suppliers. On LinkedIn yesterday, I posted one. It's in North Carolina and has over 3,000 suppliers. Just follow the link, but there's so many more. And Akhilesh is going to walk through how we take that manual process and automate it so you can leverage the 100 different databases the Apex is integrated with. So I think that is it. Akhilesh, any parting words?
No, it's always great to talk about some of the features. One of the primary reasons why we work on building them and making sure our clients are successful is ultimately we all want peace of mind at night and we can sleep well, right? And ensure that we are preventing fraud to the maximum extent possible, and money is not going out to the wrong hands, right? So that's the entire goal of some of these exercises. So really happy to present and answer any questions that you may have as a follow-up.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.